Hi, and welcome to another Mindmaxing podcast. And this series of podcasts, we're looking at the pathways from adolescence to adulthood and what kinds of things happen in an adolescence journey to adulthood and how education either helps, hinders, enables, or provides obstacles in that pathway. And today, I'm delighted to be talking with Anthony Carnevale, who is the founder and director of the Georgetown University for the Center of Education and Workforce. And I got a chance to hear Anthony speak about 5 years ago at a Georgetown event and loved, the thoughtfulness and the broad reaching and broad ranging ideas that he had then. And then I've also used the CEW data on the value of college majors in terms of looking at the horizons of 5 and 10 and longer years post-college around the value of different majors from different institutions, and have found that data to be both fascinating, interesting, surprising, and particularly useful as MindMax markets programs for different colleges and taking a look at what people have to spend on a degree, both in terms of time and also in terms of money, and what kinds of economic return they can actually expect from that spend. But without further ado, I'd like to get started and hear from Anthony, and just I'd like to hear your thoughts about that journey that adolescents take from being a teenager and having maybe some dreams and some idea, but probably no idea about what they really want to do when they grow up, and what you see about that journey, about what's currently working from your standpoint.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be with you again. I think the primary fact here of interest is that the journey has changed, as you know. You and I have talked about that. In simplest terms, the way I can explain it is that before 1983, before the end of the 80-81 recession, when Jimmy Carter brought in Paul Volcker and shut down the economy, got rid of inflation, and then we saw what is really a revolution in the American economy, largely driven, at least measurably, by the introduction of computer-based technology, connected to all sorts of things. So that prior to 1983, that is in the 70s, if you were a young person in America, given what economists metrics used to be used in those days. If you're a young person in America, economists would say that on average, at the median, young people had become financially independent at the age of 25. And that was both true for men and women, because the metric was, when do you reach the average wage or earnings for your gender? And both men and women reached it at the median at age 25. So everybody thought then, well, 18 to 25 is the journey, right? It was a different world. You married your high school sweetheart, or you went to high school, you got a job, 3-4 years later, you married your high school sweetheart. By age 25, you were forming a family. Well, first of all, we don't talk about forming a family anymore because there's too many different kinds of families, or happily, there are more kinds of families than there used to be. So, but what has happened is the age of 25 for adult independence has now shifted to age 32. So the journey is longer. And the reason the journey is longer is three things. One is, in the 70s, you didn't need any post-secondary education or training, not really. If you could get a job on the line through your Uncle Louis at Chrysler, smartest thing for you to be to drop out of high school and take the job before it went away. But in the 80s, after 83, post-secondary education and training gradually, relatively quickly in economic time, I would argue, but gradually became the most well-traveled pathway to the middle class. And it took till age 32, which is, by the way, also in our other research, the same age at which you get a job that has some traction in it, that will move you into an adult job. The other thing is that over that period of time, on the policy front, we abandoned vocational education in high school, and we did so for good reason. First of all, it wasn't working. People were being moved into occupations where, when you look years later, they weren't doing any better than the people who arrived at those occupations with no prior vocational education. So, and the other thing was, people had enough of tracking. That is, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the world changed. And the old high school system was a tracking system. It was called the comprehensive high school. And what that meant was, originally, about 5% of the kids were supposed to go to college. And in the post-World War II era, James Conant and the powers that be in America decided that's all we needed to staff this new world economic and military power and to fight the communists. So, and then, the boys who weren't in the 5%, they took voc ed, the girls took home ec and typing, and all of them who were in that 5% got this sort of second-rate general education, different classes. And so people had had enough of that. By 1983, the Nation at Risk report, the famous Nation at Risk report from the Department of Education, said that we are under attack, and we're under attack from our schools. That is, in the end, we were losing our ability to be a world power, technology leader, and a primary economic nation, because our school system was failing. And what then happened is we gradually, took a long time, but we gradually, through education reform, installed a new system in the K-12 apparatus, which was one in which every American child was supposed to get a good general academic education. So voc ed got tossed out, and I think rightfully so. And at that point, at some point, it became obvious that you needed post-secondary, and post-secondary became the barrier. But the other thing that happened was the youth labor market collapsed in the 80s. So young people were not getting decent work experience anymore. The jobs they could get, which are much fewer, actually paid less in real dollars, didn't have the kind of experiences you needed to get a long-term career. So they were missing education, which they had to pay for and get through and so on. And they were missing good, solid work-based learning. We're still struggling how to figure out how to get the work-based learning integrated into the general education system and integrated into the higher education system, college education and training. But that's basically, that history created a world in which you really did need, overstates it a little bit, but a world in which you really did need some post-secondary education or training to make it. And everybody gradually recognized that. There's still good high school jobs, and there are going to be more of them over the next 7 years because of the infrastructure bill.
Right.
But in general, about 20% of high school jobs eventually ended up as jobs that would pay you $45K before you were 40. As that's our minimum standard. That's not a government standard. Mm-hmm. And in the end, that 20% of good jobs that you can still get with high school, they virtually all went to males. They don't go to females. So women had to stay in school longer, which I would argue is the reason they do, and go get more post-secondary and so on. So the world changed. And did so in retrospect, if you've been around long enough, it's a fairly radical change.
Mhm.
So in the end, we ended up with an education system from preschool to college, post-secondary education and training that really became all one system. It largely determined whether you're going to make it or whether you're not going to make it. Education, we prefer education as a device in America to give upward mobility because it's not communism. That is, it attaches to our individualist biases in this country, so that if you do well in school and you do your homework and you pass the tests and you go on to college and then you get a good job and then you pass that on to your children, that's the way people make it in America now. And if you ask most Americans, they support that up to a point, which is to say, we believe as a society that education is one way to solve upward mobility problems by race and class and gender and so on, because it relies on the individual effort. That's a bit of a myth, because it doesn't work out that way. So there is it's the world we live in now. Education has the power to do these things that we keep saying we want to do, which is to expand opportunity, especially to groups that haven't had it before. And education has the power to do that, but the truth is it's not doing it. In fact, I would argue on balance, education is now part of the problem. So we know now with great accuracy who's going to go to college, who's going to graduate, and who's going to get a good job. And that is a population that, in spite of the declining size of the white American population, is getting whiter and more affluent all the time. So education can do the job, but it doesn't. I'll give you one statistic that for me summarizes it, is that if you take a kid who is from a low-income family, bottom quartile of the family income distribution, and that kid does very well, we use National Institutes of Health data here, does very well on IQ tests and school tests and so on in the first several grades. And you follow them all the way through the system, which we can do now with the data, all the way to age 30-ish. You'll find that 30% of them make it. They make it all the way to a good job, which is a happy fact. 30%, almost a third of kids who don't start out well, but have good test scores, that is smart kids from low-income families, they make it. But the other fact that you have to consider here is that if you're a kid from the top income quartile, the top 25% of the family income distribution, and you have low test scores, you're in the bottom half of the test score distribution, your chance of making it is 70%. So it's still true that it's better to be rich than smart in America.
So really interesting thoughts. And I don't have that 70s and 80s background and perspective. I have watched and started Mindmax, and one of the taglines we used for Mindmax early on was making education accessible. Unfortunately, we can't really use that tagline because it implies handicapped or disability accessibility. But the focus around accessibility is something that I'm always thinking about. And I think what your last few points there highlight is, there are, choices and opportunities out there, but the accessibility, and I've been to lots of conferences and read a lot about, how do we increase that smart kid from first gen, family, how do we increase their chances? And I hear all the time, it starts at 5th grade or earlier. And it starts with the belief or the expectation that you will go to college. or the expectation or the belief that you can go to college. And that's still not, I'll call it the norm, because it isn't the norm. And so it has to be propped up, or it has to be marketed, or it has to be, something has to be changed in the, the cultural paradigm of the environment that someone's in. Otherwise, the path of least resistance leads to not having access. And so on that, not necessarily only focusing on access, but what are some of the things that are, getting in the way of I mean, age 32, I didn't realize that was the age for adult independence. And with 3 kids in their late teens and early 20s, my heart just sunk a little bit, because that's 6 or 7 more years than I was thinking. But no, in all seriousness, both my wife and I are aware, because we've watched people a half a generation ahead of us with their kids, and are seeing exactly what you're talking about. Whether they come back and stop in for a period of time, or stop in for a longer period of time, that seems to be pretty common these days. So what are some things that are causing that blockage of people having that access, or some things that are making it difficult for people to get to that adulthood at 32 or earlier?
Well, I think one of the most profound, and it shows up in the data, is the belief that young people can do it. The teachers, in substantial share, don't believe it. The parents don't believe it. The kids don't believe it. And so it's not surprising that they don't make it. That is, in the end, that's a very subtle force, because they're constantly, at least I think, in middle-class America, they're constantly being bombarded with high expectations, and being told that they've got to go to college, although there's now a reaction against that, which is not very sensible, but it's there. So that in the end, that to me is the most profound issue, in that we still do a lot of tracking in this system. It's much more subtle than it used to be. The Nation at Risk report really did bring a revolution in K-12 education. So everybody's trying to get through Algebra 1 now. It used to be Algebra 2, but now it's Algebra 1. Although you ain't going to Harvard if you don't do Algebra 2 and calculus. So in the end, there is one other date that matters a lot here, and that is not 1983, it's 1973, in which Rodriguez v. San Antonio, a court case from Texas, which, by the way, I was one of the authors of, naively and accidentally, went to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, after Brown had declared that people have a right to education, Rodriguez said, with 4 Nixon new appointees, no, they don't. There is no right to education in the Constitution. Now, that squelched a lot of litigation, which was moving very strongly in those days, to focus education spending, to make it equal at first, and then as the literature, the research got more successful, the word adequate crept in. So that, and then at that point in time, the lawyers chasing the Supreme Court gave up, and they started chasing the states, because every state has a constitution. Virtually every state constitution gives you a right to education. And since, Arnie Duncan, really, because we got to the point where, having changed high school into an academic program, the question came up, well, if you're the mayor of Chicago, you fight like hell and make sure that happens, and the schools do it, then the day after the kids graduate from high school, they have nowhere to go, and they don't have a skill. So suddenly you realize, well, something's going to be done about that. I mean, this is not working. So what happened thereafter were a lot of court cases, and they are continuing in the states, demanding that high schools make young people, the phrase is college and career ready, which of course they don't. I mean, you can nail any one of them, any high school, pretty much, unless it's a very elite high school, you can nail any of them on that one. But and lawyers are doing it and judges are responding. So we're getting another movement towards adequate funding, although the Supreme Court has pretty much ruled this out. There have been subsequent cases, and the Supreme Court says no every time, and I suspect the Supreme Court will never say yes. So I think that's the other piece of this, is how do you build an adequate education that tracks all the way to the individual, right? That you give somebody as best you can, because one of the issues with adequacy is there is no such thing as completely adequate. If your goal is to get everybody to go to college, it's just not going to happen. But what is a reasonable standard for public education in that regard? That is a big question now, and it's on the move. So I think what we know that works is that you've got to, and people think this way now. They didn't, I would say, 10 years ago. Everybody thinks the same way now about this when they think about it, and that is that it's sort of all one system, and that we've lived with this apparatus that has all these silos in it, all the way from preschool to kindergarten to grade school to middle school to high school to post-secondary, and then into the labor market. So there's a lot of emphasis now on trying to interconnect these systems. We really haven't done much with it. If you look at and I don't mean to be partisan here, but if you look at the Democratic Party platform, that all one system idea is firmly there. The last two presidential runs, the Democratic Party basically does what the Washington Post calls, in a deprecating way, cradle to career. Preschool. Biden's version of it is preschool, tripling funding for disadvantaged schools in the K-8 system, focusing on work-based learning opportunities in high school, and transitions between high school, college, and careers, trying to jam labor market. First, the standard phrasing is, we want occupational exposure in middle school. We don't want to track anybody. We want things like internships in high school, and we want internships and work-based learning in college in sync with whatever your college major is. Sometimes you can't find it, but that is, there is, if you're in engineering, it's pretty easy to find work-based learning if you can get the employers to participate, which is the other problem. There's a limit on that. But even there is much more emphasis now on integrating academic sort of general education, the stuff you got to take, the English course, the history course, and so on and so forth, say in college, and your field of study as it represents a career pathway. And that thinking has moved back into high schools now and has caused a clamor. Because if you're from a very advantaged family and you live in a wealthy suburb and you go to a high school there, chances are, I have a nephew who's going through that. And I saw his transcript because his mother wanted to brag, actually, not because he was in any trouble, which is what she told me. He had a 4.4 average. But he has 4 years of Latin. I mean, he has no applied learning, whatever, but he's going to go to a very fancy school. And not only that, he can throw a baseball 90 miles an hour. So this kid's going to go wherever he wants. So, there is a lot of high schools, elite high schools, don't want to become that. But you find in the South and the West, they're much more friendly to combining general education, even in high school, with more applied forms of assignments in academic subjects, into the integration of general and specific learning. That's kind of the new thing on the block.
So I know we're not going to go to the German model. I got that, because there's no way that's going to happen. But I had a couple thoughts. One is, doesn't it really depend on what your end goal objective is, and how one things that become very clear to me over the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 years is we're not necessarily one country. that the goals in one, say, part of the country, or as you explored, the goals with a certain population might be very different than the goals for adulthood for a different population, and therefore the pathways would be different. And I know normal schools were designed to get people on the factory assembly line. They were designed so that people could vote as an educated democracy, and that they could show up for work on time and function accordingly inside the factory. I think the world of work is so varied right now, and is only going to continue to be varied, I think. And then throw in, like you were suggesting, the regionalization, that things are different in some parts of the country than others. The population changes in the Northeast versus the South. I mean, we have a decreasing population in the Northeast of 18-year-olds that's quite significant. And that's not the case in other parts of the country. But depending on your goal, your pathway might be very different. So what are your thoughts about, like, what's the point? Like, what's the, pardon the term, end product of a high school diploma, or any one of those silos which has a transition after it?
I think we know what the point is in the United States. I think we've always known. I believe in us in that way. And that is that even before education got anybody a job, which I would say the first real era where education really mattered was in post-World War II America. That it took a long time, but we supported education much more than anybody else did, long before that. And part of that was we had a diverse population. We had all these immigrants, sort of my story and all the white people's story, pretty much. And we had to integrate them with the so-called common school so that everybody had a similar experience. But there was a great belief that in a republic, you needed an educated citizenry. In a monarchy, the only person who matters is the king or the queen. In a republic, the citizens matter and the quality of the citizenry. So I think we've been actually pretty good at this in a fairly high-minded way, which sometimes gets in the way now, because getting a job is not a high-minded idea. But I think the realization that we've come to is that it's the same goal. That is, there are a lot of educators who I know who are friends of mine at Georgetown, say, who I make very nervous because they know I know what the most high return major is at Georgetown. And it's not what 90% of them teach. It's accounting. Mm-hmm. It's not classical literature or philosophy. It just isn't. But anyway, but the truth of it is, it's all the same game. And the bottom line on education is its most profound intention, and I think it's truly American intention, is that people get to live fully to the best of their abilities in their lifetime, in their time, not in some future time or some past time, now. And I think that we still honor that. What has happened, mostly I'd say since 1983, when education requirements really ballooned for good jobs and for good reason, because people wanted better skilled workers. Employers are not just hiring degrees. That's not what's going on here. So, but the fact is, in the United States, we have a capitalist economy or a market economy or whatever you want to call it. And if you're an educator and you're truly trying to help a young person fulfill themselves, you need to recognize that unlike 1970, if you're teaching in college, for example, where most of my colleagues are, if you're teaching in college, you can give them a very full education, but if they can't get a job, they're not going to live fully in their time. The people who are jobless or have economic difficulty, it causes problems with families and neighborhoods and so on and so forth. So in the American system, and generally in the system in the Western world, more so here than in most of the rest of the OECD, the other big industrial nations, more so in America, because we have a smaller welfare state. We don't give people money very readily. So that your education is the key to your ability to make a living and have a life that you want, and to be fully a part of the life of your community, in the part of the civic life of the nation and all that. So the change in the economy it's a new challenge for educators, is that they're just not there to teach Shakespeare anymore. At some level, which is not to say that you got to get rid of Shakespeare, that's not the point. The point is that in the end, you want to be sure that everybody leaves with a future. And part of that now, as against the 70s, because high school was enough, is an economic future. And for 65% of the kids coming out of high school, maybe even 70%, that means that they need to go on to post-secondary education and training.
I'm not going to go there in terms of the colleges and schools that I've worked with that struggle with their faculty senate about what you're suggesting there, because it really is counter to how many, think their mission is supposed to serve. So, and there's a big disconnect there. So that creates, some discord for sure. So what do you see as, potentially improving the ability for, more accessibility, more people successfully making it through those pathways with less friction? I love that Hidden Brain, NPR Hidden Brain podcast they do it was on fuel versus friction, talking about just, the people don't focus on friction enough. They're busy trying to push things through. And so what could be done to improve things, to make those pathways smoother?
I think people are on the case. I think this all one system view, even though it doesn't mean we're going to get czars of the education system and the employers are all going to work for that czar. No, that ain't happening. That's stupid. I mean, the solution to this is going to be more about student supports, counseling, following students through the system looking backward and forward. That is, the K-12 educator needs to know whether the kid had preschool or not. And the middle school person needs to be sure that in the grade schools, people built their basic skills up. And middle school has to be preparation for academic high school. And high school needs to be preparation for most of the students for at least some post-secondary education or training. And the high school has to be responsible for that, has to connect to the post-secondary system. And the post-secondary system needs to be looking back at the high schools. I think the opportunities for that are rising with the demographic decline and the fact that community colleges now need to hook up with high schools. I think we're sort of on the case. The work-based learning issue is being attacked. The problem with some of this is we're getting better and better at education and connecting it to labor markets, but it's being done for the most advantaged kids. So we always had advanced placement courses, not always, but we've had advanced placement courses for a long time, save the College Board. And we've IB, International Baccalaureate's out there somewhere. I don't ever run into it anymore. But and then, so we've always had these fast tracks for the fast kids And that's fine. You don't want to slow somebody down just because they're really good. And that's criminal. So I think and now we've added in work-based learning where you can get it. It's always scarce. We've added in lots of college and career pathway work. But when you look at the programs, and most of them are unevaluated, that is, this is occurring all over the country. Linked learning in California is probably the one most known, but there are many versions of that. Our access to apprenticeships in Colorado, beginning in high school, and presumes you're going on to post-secondary education to get the apprenticeship done. So this stuff's going on all over the country. And question is, how do you make that systematic? How do you provide the supports that are necessary to carry a student through that system all the way to young adulthood, and then from young adulthood to economically, in my judgment, independent adulthood. So people understand that that's the issue now. It's just incredibly difficult work. You're talking about complex institutions and political systems, talking, I think, at bottom about people's attitudes about this. And I think that, but we're on the case. That is, this is well understood now, I think.
You talked about the 1983 sort of nation at risk, making schools sort of under attack. I think we've taken that to a new height these days in terms of, I won't call it scapegoat, but definitely a focus of attention and blame, quite frankly, for all sorts of either economic disparity or elitism is a term that's used a lot. And even more importantly in my mind, that we've come to have science be a belief or not, which is something that I feel like we're moving into a dark age in relationship to that. I think that contributes to making this a lot more complex than logic is going to solve, or common sense, what I would consider common sense solving. I just think there's a lot of barriers to even a good plan or a good thought here is going to run into a tremendous amount of difficulty in today's environment.
This was never going to be easy. Arguably, it's never been easy. And it is especially difficult now for education, because whenever it has become a fact that education is the key to your lifetime opportunity in several respects. And that fact is a very happy fact in a way. That is, the long revolution in human capital development turns out that is the key to economic success and individual success. That's not a bad thing when, people doing the hiring have an interest in the quality of education. In a republic, that's a good thing. I mean, we thought for a while in the 70s, when we were being beaten by the Japanese and the Germans, all to hell in manufacturing, there was a fear, and I remember it, I felt it, that we were about to lose, and that, my God, I'm thinking about, how the society holds together and all that. And then I'm thinking, Jesus, if we lose the economy, how the hell we're in deep trouble. We then thought, and it was common to say, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics would say this, it was common to say that we've overeducated Americans. The good jobs are in manufacturing, and that was actually true then. And those jobs were fighting with the Germans and the Japanese, and then many more people after that we started competing with. And so people would say, we can't go forward in America with people making a living by taking in each other's wash. We can't afford in America to only have what people would call McJobs, lousy jobs and so on. So that fear, the golden goose is at the center of this as well, the economy itself. although it's performed remarkably well, I think. And we have blamed educators, although being blamed in America is a way to get attention. I mean, educators made a lot of money off of being blamed. So although they got a lot of abuse, and I think the abuse in the end, there was more abuse than money. The whole testing regime, which I think was a good idea, but it went too far when it started going after teachers and systems. And we tested the bejesus out of American schools, but we didn't give them the resources to meet the skill demands that we were demanding, nor do we give them the training to do what they needed to do. So that's why I like Biden. I don't, again, not meaning to be part of, Biden represented a break. Well, actually Obama did, but Biden even more so, because his solution was not more tests, and part of this I'm sure was political. His solution was, we need to give them more money. We've pushed them on the testing in these disadvantaged schools for a long time. We know now that what they need is they need more resources, or at least we got to give that a try, because you know the stick didn't work, so we're going to have to go with the carrot here. I think that was a switch that occurred between Obama and Biden. The federal government taking its, from the point of view of conservatives, taking its boot off the neck of American education, and a shift to something that said, okay, how do you actually do this? And yeah, it's going to cost money and training. And it isn't just about discipline. That is, if you get a school that's doing wrong, you shake your finger and you warn that you're going to punish them. Well, that did some good, but we kind of ran out of that, I think, about 10 years ago.
Well, this has been great. Anthony, any closing thoughts or comments? I'm looking forward to hearing others as well on this topic, but any closing comments you'd have?
Yeah, I think we're on the way. I mean, I guess that's in my own history, I've seen so much change in the relationship between education and the economy, and now they're mutually supportive. In ways that create other issues. We don't want people to stop taking Shakespeare. Neither do most of the more sensible employers, because we know that general education does have effect, oddly enough, in the data. It has an effect on people's ability to adapt in labor markets, which makes us, by the way, our bachelor's degree is unique. The Europeans don't have anything like that. And when you look at the Europeans and us, although they're entirely different societies and all the rest of it, but our bachelor's degree outperforms their higher education reward system by a mile. Now, that may just be because of the way our labor markets are built and our capital markets and all the rest of it, but which some economists will say we're just different. But I think in the end, the happy news in the last 30 years or so has been that the economy wants full people. The economy, the employer wants the whole person on the job now, not just your ability to screw in a bolt. They want all of you showing up every day, and they want you working with other people. And that demands a lot more of you than those jobs that paid very well, where you drove in a bolt for most of the day. They paid well, but they really didn't require much other than technical skill, specific skill. Pretty much all jobs now, especially in the service economy, require a lot more than that.
Great. Well, thank you very much again, Anthony Carnevale from Georgetown, the Center on Education and the Workforce. And we will make sure to have a link to the CEW as well as part of the podcast. So thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you. It's good to see you.